Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Great Depression era. In the previous lecture, talked a little bit about FDR's personal background and biography and experiences prior to becoming president. In this lecture, we pick up the story with his policies during his first term as president, specifically those that come to be known as the New Deal. Now, one should not assume that FDR came in as president, implemented the New Deal, and the Depression went away very quickly. That wasn't the case at all. As we've seen in some of the charts I showed in previous lectures, the Depression lingers on throughout the 1930s. But when he took office, he knew he was confronted with a serious problem, and he knew that efforts up to that point had not been effective. So he had a philosophy: do something. He wasn't afraid to experiment. If something didn't work, trash it, move on, and do something else. But he was going to do something. He had an easy manner. He was optimistic, and he made people feel good. This was a great contrast with Hoover, who by the end of his presidency was stiff, uncomfortable, and afraid to act. And so FDR came in, and something he did. The first thing that FDR recognized was that only the federal government could fix the problems of scope and scale that the nation confronted during the Great Depression. The state governments wouldn't do, and private volunteerism wouldn't do. The national government had to do it. The first 100 days of his presidency are probably the most remarkable period of legislative activity in the nation's history, certainly going back to the days of the Founding Fathers. FDR had an emergency on his hands. His party had firm control of both the House and the Senate, and just about every act he suggested passed and went through. So the first 100 days were a period of great activity, and in fact, the so-called 100 days have now become a metaphor and a benchmark that all other presidents have to confront. There's typically sort of a national checkup 100 days into each new presidency. So, the legislature passed a host of new acts during these 100 days, and collectively they come to be known as the first New Deal. And we're going to talk about some different elements of that, but for the most part, these initial acts focused on relief and recovery. We've got to address the emergency in the nation. We've got to feed the hungry. We've got to house the homeless. We've got to get people back to work, and so on. Now, I mentioned in his inaugural address on March 4th, 1933, he made the famous statement that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But he also outlined a number of priorities in alleviating the Depression. We need to get people back to work, with federal work programs if necessary. We need to ease the troubles of farmers by developing more land, protecting small landowners, and propping up farm prices. We need to save the banks and secure people's money. We need to feed people. We need to get people back to work. And we need to protect the economy. So these kinds of urgent needs form the basis of the first New Deal, with a resounding mandate after the election, and both a population and a legislature ready and willing to follow him. FDR embarked on the most remarkable 3 months in presidential history. So we're going to talk about these in a number of different categories. FDR immediately called the Congress into special session. And beginning on March 9th, 1933, they passed a host of new acts and laws, creating a bunch of new agencies, which are sometimes called the alphabet agencies, because most of them go by acronyms. And I invite you to sort of catalog and study them that way if that's helpful to you. So I want to start with some of the laws related to the economy. Congress passed a number of laws to restore faith in the banks, including creating deposit insurance so that the money you put into the bank would be insured, which would hopefully prevent the runs on the banks that had driven many of them out of business. So the very first act of the New Deal Congress was the Emergency Banking Relief Act, passed on March 5th. Many banks had failed, And this act closed all banks for 4 days, known as a bank holiday, during which they would be inspected, examined, open up the books, see where things stood, and at the end of those 4 days, the banks who passed inspection would reopen and people could put their money back in with confidence. They also passed the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which still exists today, and you still see that little symbol on any bank out there today. And essentially, it ensures that any money that you deposit into that bank will be able for you to access it. There are, of course, limits. At that time, the initial limit was $5,000 would be insured. The limit is much, much higher today, hundreds of thousands. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the number is, but few of us will ever have enough in the bank to worry about running up against that limit, which is insured. They passed the Economy Act, which sought to balance the federal budget, cut federal salaries, reduce veterans' pensions, and reorganize the government to streamline and make things more efficient. And the Beer and Wine Revenue Act, sometimes called the Volstead Act, to collect money off beer, wine, and ale, which essentially did away with prohibition. And finally, they passed the Securities Act, which regulated the stock market and created the Securities and Exchange Commission, still, again, in existence today, which mandated periodic reporting of earnings and allowed the government to oversee the actions of companies whose stocks were listed on the stock exchange. So with these acts, we've restored confidence and faith and security in the banks and the stock market and the economy overall. And while it certainly takes a long time for the economy to dig its way out from the depths of the Depression in 1932, the worst of the Depression is over at this point, and the process of rebuilding begins. Another important prong in the acts of the first New Deal were those that addressed unemployment. And there were a number of them that implemented federal work projects to put people back to work. The most famous of them is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. As of 1930, there was not a single paved road in the country that connected the East and West Coast. The roads were terrible, dusty when it was dry and muddy when it was wet. The Ford Model T was like the original Explorer with huge wheels for off-road travel. So the CCC, among many other things, put young men to work on federal work projects, paving roads, building dams, protecting the environment, fighting forest fires, planting trees, and seeding grasslands across the country. The program paid young men $30 a month to work and ultimately provided more than 500,000 jobs. But it does more than just put those men to work and provide them with jobs. Because while they were working on these projects, all of their needs were met. They had housing, they were given clothing and tools and food, and so most of them sent much of their paycheck, if not all of it, home to their families, where it served to feed their mothers and fathers and siblings. And so those 500,000 jobs did something else, which was very important for FDR. It ensured him a huge block of voters, much larger than just the 500,000 themselves, who would vote for and support him in the future, not once, not twice, but in all of those 4 presidential elections that he won. The first New Deal also went farther than Herbert Hoover ever had in providing direct assistance and aid. It created the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the FERA, which created the ERA, the Emergency Relief Administration, which was headed by Harry Hopkins, a close personal friend and associate of FDR from his days dating back to his governorship in New York. This created the dole. It gave handouts, money directly to the unemployed. And recall that one of the problems with trickle-down aid is that it only trickles down so far. It only trickles down to those who have jobs in the bigger companies. This act gave aid directly to the unemployed. It also demonstrated cooperation between the federal government and state agencies. The states themselves set up work relief projects. There's some experimentation here. They're trying to see what's going to work. And there was a lot of talk about the equivalent of this being a war. The nation is at war against the Depression. The first New Deal also attempted to address the issues confronting farmers. It created the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, designed to get farm prices up and establish agricultural subsidies. Farmers were seeking what they called parity. Interestingly, they wanted parity with farm prices from the year 1914, the beginning of the World War I era, or before the World War I era, to sustain the same quality of life as they had had some 20 years earlier. The Agricultural Adjustment Act reminds us of Milo Reno and his actions, dumping over milk trucks, destroying eggs, and so on. You might listen back to the earlier lecture that describes that. This act paid farmers to destroy crops, to reduce the acreage that they were growing. They slaughtered some 6 million baby pigs, plowed under some 10 million acres of cotton. This can seem irrational in an age when so many were going hungry. But it was designed to limit the amount of product getting to market and to raise farm prices. Again, the same idea that Milo Reno had acted on. Now, the act had a number of problems, one of the most serious being that there was an aspect of trickle down here as well. The people at the bottom of the agricultural chain, farm workers and sharecroppers and seasonal workers and so on, really didn't get the benefits that were going out in the form of subsidies to the landowners and the bigger farmers. We'll talk about some of those in later lectures, some of those problems. But it did work to stabilize farm prices, and conditions for farmers gradually start to improve as the Depression wears on. We'll talk about the Dust Bowl and some of the other issues confronting farmers a little bit later. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a case known as U.S. versus Butler. And in this case, the government was suing Butler, who was a processor of agricultural goods. And the nature of the funding of the AAA was that it was taxing food processors and distributing the money to the smaller farmers themselves. The Supreme Court ruled that this sort of direct tax, taxing one person and giving it straight to someone else, was unconstitutional, and the program was overturned. Now, as we will see later, similar acts were reinstalled and did pass muster, but this is an important element of the acts of the First New Deal, that the Supreme Court overturned some of them. We will come back to that process and discuss it much more a little bit later. A final First New Deal act that I want to mention here, combining some of the elements of the others, was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which planned and directed the Tennessee River Valley system by some of the experts in FDR's administration. And the Tennessee River Valley had problems with flooding. Much of that area was impoverished. You think about some of the highlands of Tennessee and West Virginia today. And so this act provided not only solutions to some of those problems, like flood control, but also brought in electric power, fertilizer, recreation facilities, fought erosion, built some 20 dams, and brought electric power to many areas that didn't have it before. So the program not only created tens of thousands of jobs, but also helped to resolve many problems afflicting that part of the country. So the TVA is celebrated as one of the signature acts of the First New Deal. In the next lecture, we'll look at a few more acts of the First New Deal.